already been said just how crucial volunteer organisations and the voluntary sector are to the country. And I have to confess right up front, I'm very biased on this. My background before I went into Parliament was the voluntary sector. So, like all of you, I'm absolutely convinced that it's an absolutely crucial part of society and what makes society work. I worked with a lot of volunteers in a whole range of different organisations, and I think I've seen some really good examples of where it works really well, and some examples where people have had less of the good experience that they were hoping when they started working in an organisation. But there's a lot of really good practice out there that we can copy and that government can learn from. It was already been mentioned, the figures about what benefit, the economic benefit of volunteering. The figures I've seen are well over £20 billion of economic benefit to the country every year. So it's really a massive contribution that volunteering and the sector makes to Britain as a whole. But it's not just the economic contribution. Nick already mentioned it, it's also the social glue. It's the impact that volunteers and volunteering has on society, bringing people together, building bridges across communities, making people work together and support each other. And it makes a real difference to a community if there are people volunteering who care enough about the community and the other people in it to be able to put their time and effort in. That makes a real difference to the way that societies and communities operate. I think politically, it's a really interesting time actually for the third sector at the moment. You will all, I'm sure, have seen a huge increase in the demand for services across the whole of the voluntary sector. At the same time that funding is becoming harder to come by, which is putting a massive pressure on organisations, and in a lot of ways is meaning that the volunteers that we have already are becoming even more crucial. Those people who will work and provide services for free become even more important to an organisation when there's an increase in the demand for services. After the election, we're going to, no matter which party is in power, it's going to be really tough financially, and that's going to feed through to the sector as well. So it's just going to get even more dramatic, the impact of the financial crisis on the sector. So whatever is being looked at in terms of the future for volunteering, it needs to be looked at in that framework and sort of being realistic about what the possibilities are and what can be done by government and by organisations working in the sector as well. But I think because of the financial crisis at the moment, it does mean that actually the sector is far higher up in the political profile than I remember it being in the past. There's a lot more discussion about the role of the third sector, the role of volunteers, and how important they are to society. Which actually means if you're working in the sector, it's quite an exciting time, because it means that you do have the opportunity to be talking a lot more about what you're doing and about the value of the work that you're doing and the influence that you have and so on. So I think it's quite an opportunity for the sector to sort of blow their own trumpet as well and make sure that their voice is being heard. Having said that as well, most charities don't actually get any funding from the government at all. It's not, even though there is a financial crisis, 3/4 of charities don't get any state funding. They are all the small ones and the micro charities and so on. But that is still a really large proportion of the sector. So if we're just looking at the money side of it, we're actually missing out on what is important to a huge number of organisations. And clearly it's going to be unrealistic to think that the government's going to be able to provide a lot more money in the next few years. So we need to be looking at what support can be offered in different ways and to think a little bit more imaginatively about what government can do to support volunteers and volunteering. There is an area that I think the government should be looking at, which is to do with fundraising and the support for charities and organisations to become more sustainable. It's boring, techie things like reforming gift aid to make sure that smaller organisations that currently don't claim it can do, so that they get more money. There's money sitting there that they're entitled to that they're not accessing at the moment. But as I said, we also need to think a little bit more imaginatively, I think, about the support and the capacity building that the government does provide. There's been some really interesting work done through some of the government bodies around supporting collaborations and mergers and things like that to help organisations get through the financial crisis. And a lot of that hasn't necessarily been money, it's been sort of business consultancy, it's been support work and so on. And I think when I was chief exec of a charity before I was elected, one of the most valuable things that I had access to was a business consultant who came in from a completely different world, looked at the organisation that I was running and came at all the problems that I had from a totally different angle, and it was absolutely revolutionary to me. And it wasn't a massively expensive project. So there are ways that you can really provide support to organisations that aren't necessarily cash intensive. It's also about using the skills that the government has access to. There are a huge range of skills in the public sector amongst civil servants, for example, which could be used much better to support the voluntary sector. And that leads into some of the issues around volunteering. The government does need to do more, I believe, to support volunteering and to help organisations that work with volunteers. And part of that is actually in generating a culture of volunteering in the UK. In society, in government, in business, throughout the whole of society. So it's much more expected that you do volunteer and that people feel that it's part of the way of life. You've got to start early with schools. It's only a very small proportion of young people aged 16 to 25 actually volunteer. It's 1 in 5. That's much better than it has been in the past, but there's still a way to go. And there's a lot more that schools could be doing to support that and to try and encourage young people. If they get the habit of volunteering early in life, then it kind of sticks with you as you grow older, and then we end up with the benefit of their skills as they develop and learn and progress through their careers. You're more likely to be able to access those skills and those specialists, the experience that they develop throughout their life. But it's not just in schools, it's also, as Nick referred to, looking at the role of employers as well. And at the moment, only 5% of people take part in an employer-led programme. Now, one of the biggest employers in the UK is the public sector. And although there is a commitment by the government to allow civil servants to take time out to be able to volunteer, it's not promoted anywhere near enough, and not anywhere near enough civil servants are actually taking up that opportunity. There are some fantastic skills that are in the civil service, which if they were put to use within the voluntary sector, could really transform, particularly small organisations. We have someone with specialist IT skills, accountancy skills, HR, PR, all sorts of different skills that are really widely available in the civil service, could make a really big difference to some of the smaller organisations. And I think if the government was to drive that forward work from the public sector, it would lead by example, and it would show to the private sector the benefits that their employees can get as well. I've benefited hugely from the experiences that I've had volunteering. If you're well supported, you get so much out of it that you then go and talk to other people about it, and that encourages your friends and the other people that you know to go and do the same. And there are some really successful programmes within private business where they're encouraged to volunteer and they get a huge amount out of it, and that reflects then on the way that they feel about their employer as well. So we need to generate that feeling that a good employer assists and helps and encourages their staff to volunteer, because it's good for the individual and it's good for the business as well. And the final area that I just wanted to talk about is about the impact of the recession in a positive way. There's a huge amount of doom and gloom, and I know that it's a really tough time, particularly across the third sector. But there is an opportunity that's coming out of the recession as well, which is that the number of people that are volunteering has increased markedly as a result of high levels of unemployment and so on, and young school leavers, university leavers not being able to find work. Now, the volunteering at that time has benefits for both parties. Obviously for the individual, they're building their skills, they're building their experience, it'll make them more employable when the job market improves. Has huge benefits to the sector as well, of the organisations in which they're volunteering. But there's also a real potential in the future when they do get into work, as with other younger people, that you can build a relationship with that person that carries on through the rest of their lifetime. They might not always volunteer 3 days a week or whatever, but as they grow up, if they grow older, they develop new skills, they can volunteer in a different way for that organisation. And you can build a relationship that's really long-lasting and has a real benefit to the organisation over the decades. And I think using the recession as a positive bounce-off point to make sure that you build those relationships, treat volunteers well, and use them well into the future could be a real positive for the sector in the years to come. We will all say the same thing. The sector is absolutely crucial to society, to the way that our communities work and so on. And I think there is a real opportunity at the moment, particularly, to be talking about that in the run-up to the election, to be able to frame the thinking about it and to have a real influence in the way that, whatever the colour of the government after the election, the way that volunteering in the sector develops.